country safe. The threat from terrorism is one of the starkest that we face. Last year, sickening acts of terrorism in the UK claimed the lives of 36 people and, of course, changed the lives of many more. One of the attacks took place a year ago yesterday, not far from here at London Bridge and Borough Market. 3 terrorists drove a van at pedestrians enjoying their evening before attacking people with knives. Yesterday, I attended a memorial service for those who died in that attack. I was particularly struck by the words of Adele Morris, a local councillor, a resident and a mother. And she said, and I quote, "The terror attack changed this neighbourhood forever, though not in the way the terrorists had planned. This community is going to carry on being diverse, inclusive and welcoming." The service was an opportunity to remember the 8 people who were killed and the many more who were injured. But it was also an opportunity to remember the brave and determined response of our police and security services and all those who work hard to keep us safe. Armed police were at the scene in just 8 minutes, and they ran straight into the heart of danger. The London Bridge attack came after the terrorist attacks, of course, in Westminster and Manchester, and then this was followed by the attacks in Finsbury Park and Parsons Green. These attacks showed us that something needed to change. That's why exactly a year ago today, the Prime Minister commissioned a root and branch review of our counter-terrorism strategy. And that is what we are publishing today. The aim of this is to ensure that our response to terrorism is second to none, and that we are doing everything within our power to prevent terror on our streets. As Home Secretary, I'm regularly briefed on the current terrorist threat by the UK intelligence community and by our counter-terrorist police. I see, of course, the very latest intelligence. And it's very clear that there has been a step change in the threat from terrorism. Every day, I sign warrants authorising operations to investigate and disrupt terrorist plots. Last year, the threat to the UK was raised twice to the highest level, critical. The threat to the UK today remains at severe, meaning an attack is highly likely. Our security and intelligence services are right now handling over 500 live operations. They have 3,000 subjects of interest, and there are further 20,000 people who have previously been investigated, so they may still pose a threat. The biggest threat is from Islamist terrorism, including Al-Qaeda, but particularly from Daesh. While the so-called caliphate is a thing of the past, Daesh continues to plan and inspire attacks both here and abroad, as well as recruiting British citizens to fight. Over the past 5 years, our law enforcement and intelligence agencies have foiled as many as 25 Islamist-linked plots. That would mean, without their vigilance and their hard work, we could have seen one attack every 2 months. But the threat doesn't only come from Daesh. Extreme right-wing terrorism is also an increasing threat. This was tragically demonstrated by the Finsbury Park attack and by the shocking murder of Joe Cox. 4 extreme right-wing plots have been foiled since the Westminster attack. Daesh and the extreme right wing are more similar than they may like to think. They both exploit grievances, they distort the truth, and they undermine the values that hold us together. And they don't hesitate to learn lessons from each other. In Finsbury Park, the method of attack, a van driven into a crowd of innocent people, had all the hallmarks of earlier Islamist terrorism, including, of course, Westminster and London Bridge. Hours after the Finsbury Park attack, I met Runa Layla Begum at the scene. She was a local resident who described herself to me as a normal, everyday Muslim who was understandably scared for her family. It's Runa and others like her, decent, brave people who just want to get on with their lives in peace. These are the people that we have a duty to protect. That's why in 2016 we proscribed the extreme right-wing terrorist group National Action, and a year later we banned their aliases, Scottish Dawn and the National Socialist Anti-Capitalist Action Group. As we look across the UK, we must never forget that Northern Ireland-related terrorism does pose a continuing danger too. 5 attacks against national security targets were carried out there last year, and another 9 attacks were aborted or disrupted as a result of action by our police and the intelligence services. Nor, of course, are we immune to attacks by hostile states. The attempted murders in Salisbury were an outrageous attack on our soil using military-grade nerve agent that in itself was a brazen message from the Russian state. We also know that the way that terrorist attacks are now planned and conducted has changed. People are increasingly being radicalized via their computers and smartphones. They're using everyday objects such as knives and cars as weapons. And the length of time between radicalization and the attack is getting shorter. The threats are evolving. We must evolve too. In our revised counter-terrorism strategy, known as Contest, I'm outlining today how everyone can help. Contest incorporates lessons learned from the attacks in 2017 and our responses to them. It has been informed by the latest research and secret intelligence. Ultimately, our approach is about ensuring that there are no safe spaces for terrorists. No safe spaces internationally in which terrorist ideology can develop and from where complex attacks can be launched. No safe spaces in the UK for terrorists to spread their vile views or for them to plan and carry out attacks. And no safe spaces online for terrorist propaganda and technical expertise to be shared and for people to be radicalized in just a matter of weeks. We are publishing the full strategy so you can see it for yourself, but I would like to briefly highlight 6 key areas. First, we will work to disrupt threats earlier, and we are bringing forward new legislation to enable us to do just that. We'll intervene earlier in investigations. There will be longer prison sentences and better management of terrorist offenders on release. I'm grateful to the work of MI5 and police in their learning the operational lessons from the 2017 attacks and also for the thoughtful and independent oversight that was provided by David Anderson QC. Second, we will continue to make sure that counter-terrorism policing and our security and intelligence services have the support that they need. In the 2015 spending review, this government committed to spending more than £2 billion on counter-terrorism each year. We're giving counter-terrorism policing a £50 million increase in funding this year to over £750 million. And we're recruiting over 1,900 additional staff across the security intelligence agencies to improve our response still further. Third, we will work more closely with our international partners because the UK cannot tackle terrorism alone. Our cooperation with our Five Eyes partners, the EU and other allies will remain essential. The UK is widely seen as a world leader in counter-terrorism strategy. Many other countries around the world, they look to Contest and they try to emulate our evolving approach. Deepening our strong security alliances around the world will also be a major part of my job. I've already had a number of meetings in Washington, in Brussels, in The Hague, and tonight I'll be heading off to Luxembourg to discuss security issues with my European counterparts. We have always been absolutely clear that although we voted to leave the European Union, we are as committed as ever to European security. We want and we need a deep and special security partnership with the EU after we leave. and the EU needs it too. There is not a single European Interior Minister who wants to reduce the level of cooperation on security that we have now. When the British people voted to leave the European Union, they were not voting for us to stop working with our European allies to keep everyone safe. So it would be wrong and reckless for anyone to advocate any unnecessary reduction in this cooperation. Fourth, we will work more closely with key partners outside of central government. We are piloting new multi-agency centres in London, in Manchester and the West Midlands to bring together the widest range of partners and improve our understanding of those at risk of becoming involved in terrorism. We will also increase our cooperation with the private sector. As someone with a private sector background myself, I understand that government cannot deal with these kinds of challenges alone. I'm committed to improving how we work with business across a range of issues. That includes faster alerts for suspicious packages, improving the security at crowded places across the UK, and reducing the vulnerability of our critical national infrastructure. And we must also get better at harnessing private sector and academic innovation. New detection techniques, data analytics, and machine learning, they all have the potential to dramatically enhance our counter-terrorism capabilities. Fifth, we must work together to get terrorist material off the internet. Terrorists exploit the online world in many different ways. They use it to spread their poisonous message and to radicalize and recruit others, to share expertise on harmful materials, and even, of course, to plan and facilitate attacks. Under the former Home Secretary, we established the first global internet forum for counter-terrorism, an international, industry-led group to fight terrorist use of the internet. This brings together some of the biggest technology companies and has brought about the removal of terrorist online material at far greater scale and speed. Just one example. In the first quarter of this year, Facebook took action against 1.9 million pieces of Daesh and Al-Qaeda content. But of course there is much more to do, particularly as terrorists move to exploit the smaller internet platforms. We must continue to deepen and strengthen our collaboration with these key partners and to encourage them to do more. And it's one of the reasons I'll be travelling to Silicon Valley later this week to do just that. Then the sixth and final approach is to do more to prevent people from becoming terrorists or from supporting terrorism. The prevent strategy will remain a vital part of our counter-terrorism work. Yes, I recognise the criticisms, but I absolutely support it. Misapprehensions around prevent are often based on distortions. They are based on a lack of understanding about the grassroots work that's involved and the efforts by civil society groups and public sector workers to protect vulnerable people. We have a moral and social obligation to safeguard vulnerable people from the twisted propaganda of those that are seeking to radicalise them. And prevent is about doing just that. I'll give you one example of a 13-year-old. He witnessed domestic abuse at home and suffered from racist bullying at school. He started to watch violent propaganda online and to show an interest in fighting for Daesh. But he was given the mentoring and the support that he needed to stop him from going down that wrong path. Now his mum says, and I quote, "He's no longer on the path to radicalisation and all he wants is to be a car salesman." Extremists can be very effective at grooming young people. And I know that if one of my children were led astray, I would want someone to tell me and then to help me do something about it. Anything we can do, we should do to stop terrorism. Not just as government, but as citizens and communities too, especially those that are most affected. Days after the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, I recall being at a vigil in Trafalgar Square with my 11-year-old daughter. She'd heard that something truly terrible had taken place in Paris, but she wasn't entirely clear on the details or the context. She saw people in the crowd holding pens and pencils in the air, and she asked me why. I told her that the men who murdered at Charlie Hebdo had been targeted because they had drawn cartoons. When you say that in such stark terms, you realize just how absurd it sounds. And my daughter, with the innocence of a child, she was troubled by this. Because you see, she loves drawing. She wants to be an artist herself one day. So she looked at me and she said something that is seared into my memory. Daddy, if I draw cartoons, will they kill me too? So I had to explain why not, and what the issues were, and why it all happened. And that crash course in religious bigotry and hatred was a pretty heartbreaking conversation, one that I don't think any father wants to have with their young daughter. I had to explain that these murderers called themselves Muslims, that they were invoking our religion and that of my parents, my grandparents, and countless generations of Javids before them. After any attack like this, a lot of well-meaning people will line up to say that it has nothing to do with Islam, that the perpetrators are not true Muslims. I understand this reaction. I know they are not true Muslims. But there's no avoiding the fact that these people, they self-identify as Muslims. Let me be very clear. Muslims are in no way responsible for the acts of a tiny minority who twist their faith. And I know that there is no such thing as a single homogeneous Muslim community. Muslims live and thrive in all walks of British life and society. Indeed, globally, Muslims are by far the biggest victims of Islamist terrorism. And Muslims are fighting and dying on the front line of the battle against terrorism every day. It would be absurd to say that the actions of a tiny handful in any way represent a peaceful, wonderful religion shared by 1 billion people worldwide. That's exactly why, although we all share the responsibility for tackling terrorism, there's a unique role for Muslims to play in countering this threat. British Muslims up and down the country are leading the fight against Islamist extremists by throwing them out of their mosques and by countering poison online and on their streets. It is incredibly powerful when a young Muslim man turns his back on the preachers of hate and says, "Your bigotry and bloodlust have no place in the modern world." I want to say to all those who stand up against all forms of extremism that this government stands with you. I stand with you. I want to thank communities for their continued vigilance and for the support that they provide the police in these difficult times. But we cannot be complacent. Last year, the Prime Minister spoke about there being too much tolerance in the UK of extremism. There is still more that all of us can and must do to confront extremism and the extremists within our communities. We need to offer compelling alternatives to the narratives of hate. It doesn't matter whether they are Islamist extremists with their claims that that our shared values are incompatible with the religion of Islam, or the hateful extremists of the far right who feed off the narratives of Islamists to attack our multi-ethnic society. These people, they want to destroy the values we hold dear, and they want to undermine the freedoms that make us who we are. And there's one other thing that Islamists and the far right have in common. As a Home Secretary with a name like Sajid Javid, I am everything that they despise. So the way I see it, I must be doing something right. There's an ongoing battle, a battle for hearts and minds. It will be won in the schools, it will be won in the mosques, on our social media, and we must all play a role. No terrorist or terrorist group can possibly bring the people of the United Kingdom to their knees. You know, they know this. Yet they still try, and they try to undermine our sense of security, and they sow divisions amongst our communities. But they have failed in the past, and they will fail again in the future. 2017 was the worst year for attacks on the island of Great Britain in a long while. But does it feel like that we've changed as a country as a result? No. And as I look out behind me, I see Londoners still going about their lives in just the same way as they did before those terrible attacks last year. We need to remember that when the worst of human nature is expressed in an attack, we always see the best of human behaviour in the response. The heroism of people like PC Charlie Gurnegold and PC Wayne Marks, who both suffered serious injuries while protecting the public in the London Bridge attack. Or the visible public response, the blood donations, the concerts after Manchester, the multi-faith shows of support that I saw in Finsbury Park. Or even the smaller moments or gestures which remind us that daily life goes on, such as the shops reopening in Salisbury last week. This government is absolutely committed to doing everything possible to tackle terrorism. It is my first priority every day on this job. But it is also my job to be honest with you. No matter what we do, no matter how well we prepare, no government can say it will be possible to stop every single attack before it happens. This is the reality. But we will be robust and we will be vigilant. Most importantly, we must be unflinching in our values and in our way of life. We must refuse to be divided, and we must respect each other regardless of race or faith. It was hard enough for me to have that talk with my daughter following the Charlie Hebdo attack. I don't want to have the same conversation with my grandchildren 30 years from now. That is why I will do everything within my power to protect this country and our great United Kingdom. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to do some Q&A now. And I think we're starting with some questions from the audience first. So if you've got one, please put your hand up. And please, as Tom said at the start, please stand up perhaps and introduce yourself and say who you are. I think there's a gentleman there.
Thank you. John Gearson from King's College, just across the bridge. Thank you very much for your speech, Home Secretary. You talked about the support of communities very passionately, but you also talked about bureaucratic changes to share intelligence more widely with other agencies, which you're going to be trialling. I wonder, in doing this, whether you'll think also about evolving the mechanisms for oversight that you briefly mentioned at the start of your speech. David Anderson himself, in his report, talks about the limitations of his capacity to do some of these things. And I wonder, as you spread out classified intelligence to wider communities, to bodies that haven't traditionally had this information, how will you maintain public support through your oversight mechanisms? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. One of the lessons learned, I think, from the 2017 attacks by the security services themselves and by David Anderson with his oversight was that we can do better by sharing more of this classified intelligence. And so, and I think whilst it might sound self-evident today, it wasn't really happening before. And one of the things that we will be doing is piloting that through what we've referred to as the multi-agency centres in my speech. And we're going to start off by piloting in London, the West Midlands and Manchester. And just to sort of give a bit more sort of information on that, what it will mean is that starting in those areas, it will be local agencies, so going beyond counter-terrorism policing, which you would normally have shared this type of data. So neighbourhood policing, local councils, my old department, CLG, because they work with councils, the Charity Commission, probation officers, so agencies like that, and sharing the information in a non-classified form. So that's important. So it will be sort of desensitized in a way, and it will be the sort of key bits of information that are required, like biographical information, so in a sort of declassified form. And that is also to sort of protect obviously the nature of the data, but also, if you don't need to know everything amongst the agency, then no need to share it, but enough just so that they can help. And then the idea is that this will probably be some of the people I referred to earlier, I said there's approximately at the moment some 3,000 subjects of interest that the security services are sort of looking at each day. And there's also a further 20,000 of what they refer to as the closed subjects of interest, previously investigated but not anymore. Of that 20,000, I think there will always be, let's say, a few hundred that although they're sort of closed subjects, that at a local level, these agencies might be able to sort of help with them and maybe come up with an intervention program of some sort. And when we start with the pilots, it won't be in the hundreds. I think we're going to start with sort of maybe 1 to 100 or so, just to sort of start with these pilots. They are pilots, and that means that we want to see what kind of interventions, what might work best. We don't pretend we've got all the answers on how exactly to do this, but we do understand and accept that one of the lessons from 2017 was that we need to work more broadly and share that data more locally. Yes, the lady there.
Good morning, Home Secretary. Thank you very much. Caroline Flynn-MacLeod from the Security Sector Board of the Aerospace Defence and Security. I represent industry. But actually my question isn't an industry-related one, but your one about your comment that you want to work more closely with international partners and deepen security relationships. And I'm wondering what relationships that you want to deepen further, because clearly the European Union is playing hardball here. They feel that they can perhaps do their own thing without the UK. So are you thinking of deepening the Five Eyes relationship further, or some other kind of new security relationships that you want to develop? Perhaps you could enlighten us a little more on how you're going to get the European Union to play, if you like, with us when we're not members.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm thinking about both, as in our allies in the European Union, our Five Eyes allies, and others. For example, some of our NATO allies. So, first with the European Union, that at the moment there's a lot of cooperation on certainly security information, whether it's, for example, through the what's called the SIS-2 system, and even the work through Europol, Eurojust, the certain mechanisms such as the arrest warrant, investigation order. So there's all this sort of, let's say, security and crime, anti-crime apparatus. And we've made it clear that we would very much like to stay part of that arrangement. My focus is during the sort of implementation period that we'll have with the EU, so we'll have enough time to work on what I see as a wide-ranging internal security treaty of sorts that will give the sort of proper legal framework for us to cooperate, first in the way that we do today, but also to continue to cooperate that way. You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, I think you said something like the European Union have different ideas. Well, actually, the European Union is not speaking with one voice on this, and nothing unusual about that. The Commission's got its sort of hard line at the moment on so many things, and it's negotiating. You would expect a bit of that. But one thing that is absolutely clear is that already, although I've been in this role, I think it's my 5th week, I've met with a number of European interior ministers, my equivalents, and I'm going to meet many more tomorrow as well in Luxembourg. And as I referred to a moment ago, every single one that I've met, they're absolutely agreed. They not only want the cooperation to continue as it is, but they also are open to how can we make it even deeper. Because one of the reasons they rely so much on the intelligence and information we provide them. And there's not going to be a single European interior minister that would want to explain, if we weren't cooperating as we did today, they want to explain after an attack that how it could have been stopped if the British had still been involved, perhaps with some secret intelligence. And obviously the benefits are both ways. We all benefit, and that is, I think, very easy to see. So those negotiations are just starting, but I am actually, from what I've seen and just the reality of the situation, I'm quite confident that we're going to get to keep working together in such a way. You mentioned Five Eyes. I mean, obviously we rely very heavily and work together with our Five Eyes partners. And regularly we have what we call a Five Eyes ministerial meeting, and there will be one later this year in August that I'll be attending in Australia. And we're already as a group working towards that and to try and see how we can even deepen some of that cooperation further. Yes, please.
Denise Bedell from the Federation of Small Businesses. I represent the interests of small and micro businesses in London, but obviously this is relevant to the whole of the UK. You mentioned the London Bridge attack, and many of our members were inside the police cordon, and I do actually commend the Met Police's response in engaging with those businesses. But I'd actually like to hear what you've got to say about helping those businesses that were just outside the cordon. They suffered from footfall of business. They didn't have the same amount of information, and I hope in this new report there's actually more information about how to support that community, that's the business community affected directly by attacks.
Yeah. No, thank you. And of course, when terrorists strike, they want to cause as much panic and division and change our sort of way of life as much as they can, and that applies to so many things. But of course, our businesses as well. Everyone would want to see as much as possible those businesses being unaffected and being supported in every way. I think everyone can understand why in the sort of initial stages of an attack that's clearly for security reasons often not possible. And I think certainly what I've seen, and I back up what you said about, for example, in the London Bridge attack, talking to even just yesterday to some of the people that were involved in that when I went to the memorial. But we need to then make sure that we are, as government, working with businesses to have a recovery as quickly as possible soon after an attack. There is more that we can do. I think there's a role for insurers in this, and the government obviously works with insurers already on that kind of insurance. But also, I know this is something the business secretary has been looking at to see what more can be done, particularly for the smaller businesses, because it's not all businesses are clearly important, but if you're a larger business, by definition, one part of your business might be hit. You've got other parts that are unaffected. But for a small business, if that's their only outlet, then it's a much graver impact. So I think there needs to be a bit more focus on the smaller business side. Good. I think. Okay. I was going to journalists now. They are so eager. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Home Secretary. Andy Bell, 5 News. I just want to go back to the plan, which I understand is being piloted at the moment, but presumably the plan eventually to roll out information about non-classified information to various parts of local government and further. Yeah. I mean, potentially there you're talking about people who've been convicted of no offence having their information being put out into various sections of local government and other parts of the public sector. Are you really comfortable with the idea that people who are not guilty of anything could find their information being spread that widely? Doesn't this have huge human rights implications?
Well, first of all, to answer that question, if I link it to I mentioned earlier in my speech about the PREVENT programme, and then the PREVENT, those that are referrals into the PREVENT programme, some of them go on to what's called a channel programme. So those are the ones that are then focused on with interventions to try and either de-radicalise or help in other ways. And those names of those people, saying the channel programme, PREVENT, the kind of agencies I'm talking about, they're already obviously known because they're intervening locally. They're sort of known names within that system. And in both cases, whether it's sort of PREVENT, it's channel, and certainly now with the new multi-agency centres, there's nothing in there that suggests even slightly that someone's guilty of some criminal offence or they've done something sort of wrong in the sense of broken any laws. and they're not going to be on any sort of criminal records or police records. And that, I think, would be a very sort of clear safeguard in the system. Now, it will be the case, obviously, for this new sort of proposal to work as we test these pilots, that we have to provide certain biographical information, which of course will include names, addresses, and maybe not much more from the security service, so in a declassified way. But all the people that are going to be involved, they are professionals. So we're talking about probation officers, for example. We're talking about people in the education sector, people in the charity commission, for example. And they are already, all of them, because their involvement in other programs, very used to handling sensitive information. They have all been trained, or they will be trained if they need to be brought into a program. And I think that all taken together provides the safeguards that we need. Thank you. I think, yes.
Frank Gardner, BBC. Hello. Frank Gardner, BBC security correspondent. You're pouring money into counter-terrorism policing and intelligence. Great, very welcome. But at the same time, community policing is being starved of funds. Isn't there a risk here that we end up being like Brussels, where community policing simply doesn't have the on-the-street intelligence to inform about terrorist attacks?
I'd say two things to that. I mean, the first is that you use the phrase starved of funds. Since 2015, we have protected the police funding over what we might call communities policing. And in fact, in the last year, in this particular financial year, we have increased the total amount of cash available by some £460 million, which is one of the biggest increases that we've seen. So we do recognise there that there is a need for more resources. And that's certainly the message that we've got back from the PCCs and chief constables and others, and so that is being recognised. Separately to that, I've recently said, actually just last week when I spoke to the Police Federation, that given the rise in reported crime in so many other areas, and also, for example, cybercrime, past sexual offences, and domestic violence and things, the demand on community policing is increasing. So I have already decided that when it comes to the spending review next year, I will prioritise community policing, because you're partly sort of recognising the challenges that they have in terms of resourcing. But the other point I'd make, because obviously you're relating it to the terrorist threat, what we're discussing today, of course, there's no question neighbourhood policing have a big role to play, and we want to try and expand that role with some of the measures that we've announced today. But we also have to recognise that the nature of how terrorists today may plan attacks or radicalise people has changed from maybe, like, as say it was 20, 30 years ago or something. So, my colleague today, the security minister, I think gave an excellent example in an earlier interview when he talked about in Northern Ireland, and he was involved himself, maybe 20, 30 years ago, is that people would maybe after a funeral or something hang around corners and go into a pub or something, have a chat or whatever. But today, so much of it is done online, often in encrypted form, for example. And so how we police, especially terrorism, it's changing as well. So we equally need to make sure that the resources are there for the specialist policing, the counter-terrorism policing, the security services, and that's why we've also given emphasis to that. Thank you. Tom.
Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. You talk about the private sector in particular showing more of a civic duty. Exactly who is not doing enough, and what more should they be doing in practical terms? And a second quick question on the Brexit deal. Who exactly is being wrong and reckless in advocating less cooperation? You've slightly skirted around the issue on precisely who your target is on this, and which side has more to lose if there is no security deal?
Okay, two easy questions there. First, on the private sector, who's not doing enough? Actually, the first thing, I think, it's an opportunity to commend those that have started doing a lot more. I think it's fair to say that some of the big internet giants, some of the big communication companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, for example, they weren't doing enough in the past, were not. And they certainly could have help more. And I think largely because of the initiative of my predecessor, Amber Rudd, and in setting up the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism, so specifically focused on counterterrorism, and working with her counterpart in the US, they brought together these companies, met with them a number of times, and now they are doing a lot more. But when I say now they are, we're really talking about starting this year. And I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, Google, for example, they're focused a lot more on machine learning. So they're not waiting for people to flag content up that's worrying. They're using machine learning techniques. And so Google are saying that now 98% of the content that they're removing, that is extremist or terrorist related, is because of machine learning. I gave you that example about Facebook earlier in my speech. Twitter tell us that 93% of the content is being removed now because of automatically, but through machine learning. And of that 93%, some 74% is being taken down those accounts even before the first tweet is made. Right? So that's how the machine, and they're using some techniques that I won't get into on that. And so they are doing a lot more. That said, they can also still really push what they're doing up as a further priority. And that's why I'm actually going this week, as I mentioned, to Silicon Valley with my counterpart from the US and others. I'll be meeting with all these big companies and others, including some of the smaller platforms. And we've got some specific ideas. I shouldn't say what they are now because I want to give them a fair opportunity to reflect on them. But we can actually go much further. And the last comment I'll make is the smaller platforms. I refer to smaller platforms, especially on some that use for communication purposes. So you said who's not doing enough? There's a communication platform called Telegram. It's not doing enough. And let's see if it's listening to what we're saying and what others are saying. But there are some ways that terrorists can still communicate, encrypted and otherwise. And so there's still a lot more to do in this area. You also asked about the EU and cooperation. You said who might be saying that. The EU Commission. So the EU Commission have a group of people looking at what they would recommend to member governments in terms of a final withdrawal agreement. And at the moment, their recommendation when it comes to security, I don't think they've really focused on it enough yet, is that Britain should be treated as a third country just like anyone else. I think the group is called Task Force 50 that deals with the recommendations from the Commission. And so that's who I had in mind when you said to be very specific in that. Who loses more? We'd all lose. I mean, I'm not going to play the game as more them than us, and we would all lose. When I look at the exchange of information or the use of arrest warrants or any multiple factors, Europol. I was at Europol last week. I went to have a look. I met with the new director of Europol myself, and went through in detail. Had a round table with officials at Europol, and it's absolutely clear that just take that one institution, Europol. We would all lose. And it's hard to say one more than other. We would all lose out if we didn't cooperate in the same way. I think one more. Yep. Thank
Kate
you.
McCann from The Telegraph. Home Secretary, you say you want to work more closely with the private sector, particularly when it comes to people who are buying suspicious items. You've also said that you want to toughen up terror sentences and stop plots sooner. So what does that mean for people? So if I buy a load of fertiliser for my roses, for example, am I going to end up on a watch list? Will I get a visit from somebody? And how do you prevent this from happening to people in real life while still making the policy effective?
Well, look, clearly in taking such measures, we've got to be sort of proportionate, sensible in terms of what we're targeting. We've got a counter-terrorism bill coming to Parliament very, very soon. And in that, you'll see more details on what we are focused on. But the focus will really be on not necessarily stopping people in every case that there's certain things that they're buying, but working with the private sector. If there are things that have so-called dual use, then we would want to make sure that we are sharing information with those companies and they're sharing it with us, so that if there are people that the security service might be concerned about, that information is flagged up more quickly. And I think there are sensible changes like that we can make in just sharing information more quickly with the right people, and just in case they were sort of flagged up for another reason as a person of concern, then action might be taken. And I think that's a sensible approach. But I'll give you another example, which is sort of also covered in the CTB about some of the on sentencing. I talked about how we want to have a look at some of the offences. You know, one thing that was a lesson from 2017 attacks was that we need to be better at disrupting potential attacks much earlier on. And at the moment, we don't feel that there are enough offences on the statute book that may be less serious offences that would give the ability for the police or CPS to charge someone or prosecute someone sort of early on. So I'll give you an example. Like, for example, today, if someone is encouraging terrorism online, they're sharing information clearly, they're sharing images, there's a certain threshold that needs to be reached before the police or CPS can act. And we want to lower that threshold because it would allow us to intervene and bring that person in, perhaps some more questioning and so forth, a lot earlier, and I think it's sensible. And then one final example I'll give from the CT bill is and this is about keeping ahead of technology. At the moment, it's clearly, understandably, an offence if you download videos, terrorist-related videos, but not if you stream them. So when you stream something, that's more and more people today, compared to even 5 years ago, are streaming videos rather than downloading. And there's an anomaly in the law there, so there's to be sort of the digital fixes like that the bill would also provide. Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you.